boys and girls, happy Wednesday. We are going to read chapter 3 of Flat Stanley. You may be getting your Flat Stanley in the mail today. Depending on what time your mail comes, you may get it today. And if not, I bet you will get it tomorrow. So keep your eyes watching, and hopefully the mailman or mailwoman will deliver it to you within the next couple of days. But this is chapter 3, and it's called Stanley the Kite. Remember, at the end of chapter 2, Stanley had just gotten back to his house and was telling his family about his trip to California. So let's see what happens in chapter 3. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park. But it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. But it was easier after Stanley got flat. What did he do to Stanley? He just rolled him up. No one could hit him then. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a bag, and he could hold on to Arthur with his other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he never had much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to, and it made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Going to decorate your house, I guess?" "Wallpaper," said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no. This is my son, Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," the man said. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." "He's smart, too," said Mr. Lambchop. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. So I think Arthur got a little upset or maybe jealous that Mr. Lambchop was telling George how good Stanley was in school. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges. But Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying in the living room floor near the bookcase. He had piled a ton of volumes of the encyclopedia on top of himself. The encyclopedia is big, thick books that you look stuff up in. And he had piled lots of them on top of him. "Put some more on me," Arthur called out when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." What do you think that Arthur is trying to do? You think he's trying to flatten himself? Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed. But the next morning, they did speak to Stanley. "Stanley, Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I'll have a big kite, and I'll win the the kite flying contest, and be famous like everybody else. Nobody knows who I am these days. Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold on to. He ran lightly across the grass and sideways to get up speed, and then he turned up and caught the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gust of wind. He would glide back and forth. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise higher, and let it take him from behind when he wanted speed. He only had to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully, a little at a time, so that it did not hold him. And then he would slip gracefully towards the earth and come back down. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees. A beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long swoops, and he held his arms by his side, and he zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again towards the sun. He slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses like a star. Nobody had ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running with the spool of string. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. There he is, soaring around. Look, all the people below have stopped to watch who? Stanley. And it says that Arthur got tired of holding it, but Stanley kept on going. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for hot dogs and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it in the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his face, and it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up the tree to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur apologized, he was still mad. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "It's just a phase. Be patient, dear." There he is, stuck in the tree. And Mrs. Lambchop is saying she can't handle the 2 boys together anymore because they're jealous and fighting. That's the end. The next chapter is chapter 4, The Museum Thieves. We will read chapter 4 tomorrow, boys and girls. I hope that you are enjoying Flat Stanley. We're actually almost done with it. I think only 2 more days. And I hope that you get your surprise in the mail either today or tomorrow. And I cannot wait to see what you will do with your flat to farthing when you get it. Bye-bye. Have a great day.